I'm excited to be here and really happy to have discovered this platform where I can talk about Henry Miller and Japan for this extended period of time. And hopefully I will try and do my best to make sure that I keep you interested. Let me share my screen here, make sure everything's working. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, Joel, does everything look good?
Yeah, everything looks good.
Okay, great. All right, so let's get started here with my research. I was almost said my passion, but definitely my research and about Henry Miller in Japan. And I call it the allure of Japan because it was definitely for Miller something that was a lifelong interest, which I think makes this topic so interesting. Oh, my pointer is now not working. Okay, do it manually. So why Miller and why Japan? Just to give you kind of an idea of why I'm pursuing this is because this is a completely unexplored area of Henry Miller studies and Henry Miller biography. Now, I have no intention to write a biography about Miller, but what I want to present today deals with his entire life and kind of snippets or sections of his life where Japan really came to the forefront of his interest and the impact in his life. The why Miller, why Japan? Basically, how I, in a sense, stumbled across this was back in 2012. I was at UCLA, which holds the largest collection of Henry Miller material in the world. And I was going through fan mail letters. So I was really interested in fan mail to Henry Miller. I was looking for a very specific person's name. It was a needle in a haystack. But I came across several dozens of letters from Japan. And, you know, I was just like, why are there so many letters here from Japan? You know, to Henry Miller, like what is going on here that, you know, I've never read about before related to Henry Miller. So basically, I discovered that Miller's popularity in Japan was fairly, he was incredibly famous and popular here. And so what I want to show today is to kind of go through the process of, not process, but the historical background of Miller's life and his connection with Japan and how it grew throughout his literary career. Just for those of you that may not know much about Miller, I'll give you a little bit of background here. He was born in Manhattan in 1891 and died on the other side of the country in Los Angeles in 1980. Up until the age of 39, he had been in and out of New York City, mostly in New York City, a couple excursions here and there, one down to Florida and one out to California. But basically, he was trying to become a writer without success. And then at the age of 39, he moved to Paris. And this is where he was able to find his authorial voice and, you know, and write his famous, probably easily his most famous novels of Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. So that was 10 years experience. Then from 1942 to 1960, he lived in California in Big Sur, very remote area of the country at the time. And he lived a very humble life, but certainly very interesting. He details it extensively in his book, Big Sur and the Oranges of Harmonious Bosch. But then in 1961, he moved down to Pacific Palisades to be closer with his family, but also because of health issues. He was kind of getting up there in age, and the mountain rugged region of Big Sur was probably not the best for his hips in particular. The most important bit of information on this page here on this slide is that Henry Miller never visited Japan. So that might be kind of interesting, like, how am I doing this, all this research about Henry Miller in Japan, and he never came here? I'm in Japan, obviously. That's some of the people that I've interviewed over the last 5 or 6 years have kind of been a little surprised that I'm pursuing this angle, because even though they knew Miller personally or indirectly, they did not realize that there was such a strong connection with Japan. So definitely an area where the research, it's sort of just, it shoots up like mushrooms. It's kind of like just like new avenues come up all the time, it seems like, for me. And it's quite exciting. Okay, so what I want to do here is the way I've designed this layout, or this workshop for today, is I want to go through and kind of sequentially go through what I hope will be my book chapters for the book that I'm beginning to work on. And for you participating in this today, or even after in the recorded part, if you see something that you want to know more about, or that seems really interesting and I don't flesh it out enough or talk about it enough, definitely let me know at the end of the presentation, because I'll take notes, and then I can, it'd be some really good feedback for me. So please definitely keep in mind that I'm kind of using this workshop to work through my book idea. So let's get started with Madame Butterfly in New York City. And this is a theme that's going to carry through the arc of Miller's interest in Japan. Madame Butterfly, of course, is the famous story by Loti in 1887 or so, and or excuse me, Madame Chrysanthemum. And Miller read this when he was living in New York City. And his first initial exposure to Japan and Japanese stories and Japanese culture came from New York City. And you could pretty much say that New York City in the 1910s, early 1900s would be the epicenter of Asian culture in the United States. So Miller was definitely exposed to that at a young age, in his teens and in his young adult years. But he attributes his interest in Japan specifically to an event, or maybe not necessarily an event, but a kind of a daily reoccurring thing of his walk to his parents' tailor shop. And that would be walking through Manhattan and coming across the artwork of Hokusai, Utamaro, and Hiroshige, which are obviously the famous woodblock artists that were hugely popular, and still are really, for that type of Japanese art. And when he saw that in a New York City art shop window, it mesmerized him. And he was a prolific reader, but he read the story of, about Madame Butterfly and whatnot. And there is actually something called the Madame Butterfly effect, which is basically this kind of overemphasis of a Western image of Japan and the ethnic other. This kind of romanticizing of Japan, right? And Miller fell into this Madame Butterfly effect, and I would say that it carries over throughout his entire life. In a couple of his, in Plexus, which he wrote in 1959, he said things like Japanese prints adorned the walls. He's talking about his life in Manhattan in the 1910s with 1920s with his wife June. Japanese prints adorn the walls. They hang in the bathroom as well. They're under glass table. For weeks after reading Loti's work, I feel as if I were living in Japan, right? So he's writing in his semi-autobiographical novels about his reflection of the 1920s. So he's writing in 1959, he's looking back at the 1920s, and he's recalling this Japanese impact in his life. Now, one of the things that I would argue is that by 1959, as we'll see a little bit later, Miller was pretty popular in Japan. And so I would argue that he added these embellishments to his recollection. And one thing that I have to support that, which I actually just got 2 days ago, is the drafts of his, his notes to the Tropic of Capricorn. These have been unpublished as of yet. They will be published in the next Nexus journal. But in there, he talks about his living environment, and he talks about the love nest. But in Plexus, he refers to it as a Japanese love nest. So the original notes were written in 1927. Plexus was finally completed in 1959. So over that 30 years, he seems to have added or embellished the presence of Japan in his life. There's an interesting aspect, I think, of Miller's preferred recollection of his earlier life. However, there is definitely some factual things that we can look at about Japan and Miller being influenced by Japan at an early stage. And in particular, there's a character named Mr. T. His real name is Tori Takekuchi, but in Sexus, Miller refers to him as Mr. T. And Mr. T was a person who boarded at Miller's house for several months in 1921. He was a young Japanese man, very proficient in English, studying economics. And he lived there and really exposed Miller for the first time to Japanese culture. And Miller wrote about Mr. T in his novel Sexus, which is the first novel of the Rosary Crucifixion in 1949. And he writes about Mr. T's sexual escapades, let's just say. And it's about 10 pages long in the novel, so it's a fairly extensive focus on a Japanese person in Miller's writing. So that's an important clue or early link to Miller and Japan. Now, there is one letter that still exists from Mr. T. It's from 1929. It's at the Harvard Archive Libraries. And in the letter, Mr. T talks about his fond memories of Miller. He talks about Hollywood films, and he talks about some of the situations that are going on in Japan politically in 1921. So this letter is really important because it's the first actual document that we have that can tie Miller specifically to Japan, even though he writes about it in Sexus. But this actual physical letter gives us an actual date where we can say that Miller was learning and being exposed to Japanese culture. Interestingly enough, after Sexus was translated into the Japanese in 1953, Mr. T read the novel, remembering his old friend from 30 years before, and they started up a correspondence again. So from 1955 to 1960, they shared some letters, not a lot, but during this time, interestingly enough, Mr. T writes to Miller that he and his wife, Mr. T and his wife, had a really fun time reading about the description of the young Mr. T from 1921 and the sexual escapades that he went on and whatnot. So so this experience from 1921 follows Miller, goes into the 1950s and into 1960, and makes this a very personal connection, the first personal connection that Miller had with Japan. So then in 1930, Miller goes to Paris. In Paris, he is exposed, he is at the epicenter of Japanism, and there he is exposed to a much greater extent to this Western infatuation with Japanese art. He lives in the same neighborhood as Fujita, who was a very interesting, eccentric Japanese artist living in Paris at the time. I'm going to move through this a little bit quicker here because I want to get into some of the kind of the more of the juicy stuff from a little bit later in his life. But I think I would be remiss if I did not talk about the China versus Japan aspect of Miller's writing. In his 1936 collection of stories or essays, he has this walking up and down in China, and he basically refers to Paris as the China of Europe. And so I would argue and would say that China for Miller is a much more philosophical aspect of his thinking, whereas Japan is a much more actual romanticized dream world that is not so philosophical as China, but is just as enticing, if not more so, than China. At the time, he was having his famous affair with Anais Nin. She was also interested in the Orient, interested in Japan and whatnot. And at one point, after Miller saw, you may wonder why I have this, the Madame Butterfly, when this is an American film with Cary Grant, but Miller first saw this film in Paris. And after seeing so, he said, whether it's because I'm becoming so definitely Oriental or what, I don't know, but I'm stirred all over again because of this film, Madame Butterfly. He was exposed to or was able to watch a lot of Japanese films there. And these even impacted his dreams, which he recorded in his dream books at the time. Then after he had to move out of Paris, we have what I call the interval period from 1940 to 1950, where there's not a whole lot that I've been able to uncover so far about his connection with Japan, but there are a few very important things that happen. The first one is in 1940. In Japan, the first article in Japanese that mentions Miller is published. And it's published by Totaro Hosoyori, who in 1939 went to London and traveled around Europe and was able to get a hold of some of Miller's literature. And he came back to Japan and he wrote about American and European literature in a very lengthy journal article. And interestingly enough, in the article, which mentions Miller and Anais Nin, he refers to Miller and Nin as my friends, which strikes me as very odd Japanese phrasing. and so there may be the chance that he actually did meet Miller in 1939, before Miller went to Greece, and then before Miller came back to the States. So areas for exploration there. But what's important about this 1940 publication is that this is the first time that there's a shift from Miller looking at Japan to Japan now actually starting to recognize and see Miller. And so at this point, from 1940 to 1953, Miller starts getting some letters from Japan from translators who are basically requesting Miller's books because they can't get them in Japan. Of course, he was banned until the 1960s in the United States, and had some legal issues in Europe as well. But this sort of marks the Miller's growing awareness of his the beginning stages of his fame in Japan. So what happens next, though, is where Miller really takes off in Japan. And of course, his works are known as pornographic, banned for 30 years in numerous countries around the world. But Japan is one of those places where Miller actually was accepted as literature earlier than some of the Western countries, certainly before the United States, before England, before Australia, but mostly English-speaking areas before, and then some areas in Asia as well. But what happened was some of his books got into Japan, and a small limited editions club, Tokyo, it was a gentleman's club, started translating some of Miller's work, in particular Tropic of Cancer and Sexus. And in 1952, they sent around a private publication of Miller's the first translations of Miller's works. These were all bootlegged. They were not done legally at all. Of course, it was illegal in Japan to publish pornography. So, you know, everything around on all ends of the spectrum where it was just basically illegal. But they were, I guess, well received enough that by 1953, the first Japanese publications of Miller's work, full translations, or near full, I should say, were actually published. And sort of what the translators did was pretty sneaky. They went ahead and published the entire book of Sexus in 1953, but the very first version, they left the really risque parts, the pornographic parts, in English. And then the rest of the narrative, they translated into Japanese. And when it got pulled up into the courts for this edition, the judge was like, this is a ridiculous attempt to publish pornography. Any high school student with a dictionary could easily figure out what these English sections say. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what the judge was saying. But by that point, Miller was the publishers were going ahead and translating Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn, Sexus, and things like that. And so by 1954, you have the first official full Japanese translations of Miller's work, which were arranged through Miller's French publisher. So these were not bootlegged, even though Miller tended to think that they were. But by March 1955, you have the police breakdown. The publishers, the printing company, the bookbinding companies are all raided by the police. It's front page news in some sections, or photographs of the police going into these, into these bookshops and taking up Miller's books. Of course, all make for great press and publicity. And this is basically the start of Miller's fame in Japan. He was linked next to D.H. Lawrence, which also happened in the United States as well, for the obscenity trials in Japan. One of the Tokyo District Prosecutor's Office said, in general, this is a far more this text is far more obscene than Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is often the text that Miller gets compared with. So we have this happening. Then also at the same time, and what some people don't actually realize is that Miller was also a watercolorist. And through his connections with some of his people that he had been in contact with, he was able to set up, through a man named Tanaka, his first watercolor exhibit in 1953 in Tokyo. And this marks a crucial turning point, because as much as the global recognition of Miller resides or rests in his literature, Japan is one of the few countries, I think, that really embraced Miller's watercolors. They were quite successful in being sold here, and as I'll go through and share with you a bit more about the watercolors, this marked a turning point. However, it wasn't as successful for Miller as it was for Tanaka. Basically what happened was Miller arranged for this, Miller and Tanaka got this conference, or excuse me, watercolor exhibit set up. Miller sent over several of his watercolors, and the exhibit was held, and afterwards, Miller never received a penny. He didn't get a single yen out of the whole transaction. Basically what happened was Tanaka went bankrupt and never paid Miller. And so these dozens of watercolors were dispersed throughout Japan because they were all actually sold, which is kind of an interesting, so Tanaka obviously made a significant amount of money, presumably, with this watercolor exhibit, but Miller never saw anything. And so this was the first of Miller's kind of bad impressions of doing business with Japan. And he did not forget about this very easily. And it came up over and over again, as we'll see later. But basically, the watercolors all sold, several dozen that he sent over. And this watercolor exhibit was one of those events that helped Miller move out of that pornography image into this actually is a full, to be respected artist. Now, this exhibit had lasting repercussions, not only with the bad impression that Miller had dealing with Japan, but with some of the people that went to that exhibit. So in 1956, this is another significant year for Miller. In 1956, Miller, in his Big Sur house up on top of a cliffside overlooking the ocean, he gets a package from Japan. And inside the package is some watercolors material and some paintbrushes. And there's no note, and there's just a name and a reply address, or a return address. So Miller writes a letter, a short little letter. Dear sir, I received these watercolor supplies. Thank you very much. Can you tell me who to thank? And he was writing to a man named Kubo Sadajiro, who was an art critic and an art dealer here in Japan. And Kubo had gone to the 1953 art exhibit. And there he had bought several of Miller's watercolors, and he had been completely enraptured with Miller's literature. So in 1956, Kubo finally found, it took him a long time to find Miller's address, even though it was the address for Henry Miller at the time was Henry Miller, Big Sur, California. No address, nothing. That's how remote the area was. It was just Henry Miller, Big Sur, California, and that letter would get there. So anyway, Kubo sends this package as sort of a thank you or introduction, and they get into a correspondence, and I call this the first real significant correspondence of Miller's relationship with Japan. And they remained in business friends and partners until Miller died in 1980. And you can see in this photo here, this is Kubo-san standing behind Miller. They met twice. He was a collector, as well as an art dealer, as well as an art critic. He has numerous books written about literature. Miller was not his only infatuation, and he was, I guess, lucky enough to have come from a wealthy family and been encouraged by his family, Kubo-san, encouraged by his family to pursue his interest in art. I do want to point out here, he was a collector of Miller's letters, art and letters, and this has been incredibly important for my research. This is Kubo's family property here, this top photo, and they've now converted it into a museum with exhibits. But in that building, there are over 2,000 Henry Miller original letters, and some of them are incredibly rare, and unknown. And I've been there 3 times, and some of the material, I swear I'm the first person that has looked at it since the archivist outlined what's there, and then since Kubo-san bought it back in the 1980s. So lots of original Henry Miller letters there, some really rich material is actually stored in that house. Not all of it related to Japan. Some of it's I've published some articles about that. So if you're interested, you can check that out. But after Miller died, Kubo in 1985 founded the Henry Miller Society of Japan, and that society is still in existence still today. And even though it's the numbers are definitely dwindling, I think we're probably around 10 now. But at its peak, the Henry Miller Society, and its peak was 1991. There were 160 members. Okay, moving on. So after Kubo started promoting Miller's watercolors, Miller overcame the legal issues with his books. His popularity in Japan continued to increase quite extensively, exponentially. It's probably the right word. And so by 1959, Miller was thinking, it might be time to go visit Japan. And as I said in the beginning, he never actually made it to Japan, but he did have 3 significant attempts. And probably the most significant was 1959, where he actually, you can see here, there were actually reservations for his tickets to go, but he never did go. There are a number of reasons that I think why. One of them was so he had several fears about the potential of going to Japan. The most common one that recurs all the time is the weather. I don't know whether he had just been. Well, it's kind of interesting. In Japan, the Japanese talk about weather a lot, more so I feel than as an American we do. And so I think Miller did not understand that. And so when the Japanese would say, "Oh, it's so cold in the winter," he took that to be like, Arctic temperatures and things like that. When, I think part of Japanese culture is to, when talking about the weather, is to embellish it or to just, talk extensively about it. And I think that scared Miller away. The other thing that, he had such a dream, the Madame Butterfly dream of Japan, that I think that was probably, he was afraid that he was a little bit afraid that if he actually went to Japan, he would, that bubble, that dream would be destroyed. So instead of going to Japan, he goes to Europe a couple of times. He went to Europe in 1958, and then in 1960, he goes to the Cannes Film Festival. He's invited to be a judge, and he goes there, and at the festival, he sees Junichiro Tanazaki's 1959 film, which was oddly called Odd Obsession in English, but basically The Key or Kagi. And Miller is on the jury committee to this, and they're shown this film, and Miller just falls in love with it. He is over the top, enthralled with it. And because he was on the jury committee, and because he argued so extensively or successfully for this film, it won the jury prize. And with that award, then Tanazaki's novel then got translated into a lot more languages. And because of Miller's connection with both the French and German publishers of this text, which Miller encouraged them to publish, those publishers asked Miller to write the introductions. So there's a French and a very rare, hard to get German text by Miller about this novel and the film. And so if I had more time, I would talk more extensively about these introductions. But basically, these efforts by Miller sort of endeared him to Japan. Tanazaki's success at the Cannes Film Festival. Well, why was he so successful? Oh, well, this guy named Henry Miller, who's a literature guy, was promoting this. This sort of endeared him to Japan. So 1960 marks the point where Miller becomes a bit more vocal about Japan and promoting of Japanese art, from everything from woodblocks to especially films. He was a huge fan of the films and the literature. So lots going on here. 1955, he wants to go to, seriously thinks about going to Japan. 1960, he promotes the Tanizaki film. And then also in 1960, and this may surprise some of you, or at least I hope it does, we have unbeknownst to Miller, we have what I call Kate Millett's significant encounter. Some of you might know Millett as a leader of the second wave feminism movement of the 1970s. That in particular really boosted Annie Snin's diaries. But what might not be known is that 10 years before Millett published Sexual Politics, she was actually living in Japan from 1959 to 1961. She was teaching English and practicing, studying sculpting. And while she was there, she had access to all of Miller's major works, which she would not have had access to in the United States. And so it was there that she first read Henry Miller. She taught at Waseda University as an English teacher for a while. And during that time, the professors at the university asked her to write an article of appraisal about Miller's works. And so Kate Millett's first publication about Miller actually came 8 years or so before Sexual Politics created such a revolution. in the world of second wave feminism. And this is really important because I think it creates a very interesting background to sexual politics, and perhaps one that's not known very well. And I was fortunate enough to be able to interview Kate Millett back in 2017, about 3 months before she died suddenly on a trip in Paris or France. And we talked about her experience of being in Japan and reading Henry Miller. And, you know, when she read Henry Miller, did she, you know, feel this, you know, this angst or, you know, did she, the ideas that she puts forth in sexual politics, were those born while she was, you know, reading Miller in Japan? And she told me that no, they were not. And that basically, while she was in Japan, she was feeling very lonely and missing America. And Miller's works were actually very soothing for her, even though she didn't agree with everything, obviously, but that she really respected his writing and felt a very strong connection with the way he wrote as an American. Of course, that doesn't necessarily come out in sexual politics, but when Millett was writing sexual politics, she wrote a letter to Miller asking Miller to permission to quote from his texts. And when she wrote that letter, Millett sent along a copy of her journal article from Waseda University. And in the very first lengthy paragraph of the letter, Millett talks about how important Miller's literature was to her while she was in Japan. And it's quite a detailed historical biographical element of Millett's life there. And it's quite interesting. And so she sent that along to Miller. That it was a 2-page letter along with the Waseda University journal article, and which was published in English. And then Miller writes a reply and says, "No, you cannot quote from my books. The way you approach my literature, you don't understand me," type of thing. So he did not really like the Waseda University journal article. I asked Millett about that in the phone interview, and she basically said, "Fuck him." I went ahead and published the materials, which I thought was pretty awesome. And she told me that she had a love-hate relationship with Miller's work. So some of it she thinks is really fantastic writing. Some of it, obviously, she has some serious problems with. And whatnot, and we could get into a long discussion about that, but that's not my area of expertise. But this significant encounter in Japan, I think, obviously had a profound impact on Miller's reputation as a pornographer or sexist and things like that after Sexual Politics was published. Okay, moving on here. 1965 marks another important year. It's when Ueno sensei sends his first letter from the Orient, as he said in his letters. And Ueno, I call the philosopher samurai. He writes his first letter to Miller on January 26, 1965. Their correspondence explodes over the next 15 years into more than 400 letters. So it's a massive correspondence. I refer to it, and I think I've published an article on it, calling it the last correspondence. These letters are just full of amazing information, especially what Ueno sensei was sharing. And none of these letters have been published. In fact, it's almost impossible to find Ueno's name in connection with Miller, except in a couple. The one that comes off the top of my head is Miller's letters to Hoki Tokuda, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. He mentions Ueno a few times. But anyway, Ueno's letters are not published. Miller's letters to Ueno are not published. However, those Miller's letters are here in Japan, and I have met Ueno. Actually, I took this photograph of Ueno in his previous apartment wearing Miller's hat that Miller sent him several decades ago. And Ueno has saved all of Miller's letters and has graciously given me permission to look at them and use them for my research, although some of them are lost. But anyway, Ueno was a minister and very poor, really poor guy. And so Miller actually helped financially support him as he was writing. And Ueno has published numerous books. In fact, I have an entire shelf up there of Ueno's books, but none of them are in English. A couple of his books are about Miller, but all in Japanese. Okay, moving along here. Probably, if any of you know anything about Henry Miller and Japan, you know about Hoki Tokuda, Miller's fifth wife, that he met in 1966. This is the Miller, like I said, his fifth wife. So he wasn't too successful. We can, we can talk about that, but really interesting aspect of this. He became obsessed, and I use the word obsessed because there's really not much else to describe it. If you read the letters from Miller to Hoki Tokuda, he sounds like an old man obsessed with a young Asian woman who was 27. He was 75, she's 27, 50 years difference. He proposed 3 times. She turned him down 3 times until her green card or her visa ran out. And then she needed a green card. And then all of a sudden, they were able to get married. It was there's nothing, it was a friendship. It was a marriage sort of based on friendship. But leading up to it, Miller was so obsessed with Hoki that, he started to have these fits of insomnia. And so these sleepless nights led to the work Insomnia or the Devil at Large, which was published in 1970. 3 years after their marriage, by which time Hoki was not living with Miller. But it's a creative work for sure. And along with it were the watercolors. And the watercolors in particular, I have looked at in the past. You can see in this one, there are, here's a samurai looking guy here, and then he mixes in all different kinds of languages and whatnot. And so there are several watercolors in this Insomnia series that are specifically Japanese themed. They have some Japanese wording in there and whatnot. And yeah, so, but what I'll continue talking about Hoki here as we go through these next few slides. But after his marriage to Hoki, he was able to arrange a second watercolor exhibit. And this one was very, very popular and incredibly successful. The artwork was designed by Tadanori Yoku, who is still one of Japan's most famous and creative artists. And this was sort of Miller's second attempt to reach Japan. So he had intended to come to Japan for the opening of this watercolor exhibit, landed, the only person that walked off the plane was Hoki. And so Miller did not come for that visit that time. And one of the reasons was because his astrologer had told him, if you get onto the airplane, it will crash. And so Miller decided that he would take that advice and not get onto the airplane. Hoki was sent to be in charge of this exhibit because of Miller's lasting memories from that 1953 exhibit where he got paid nothing and all of his watercolors disappeared. And it was featured major national news, traveled all around the country. By this time, Miller's fame was almost at its peak with the success of his novels, then with his courtship and then marriage of Hoki, and then with this watercolor exhibit, he was reaching or certainly coming up to the peak of his fame there. Probably would max out around 1970 would be my guess, and then kind of really wane off after 1972. Real quick here, note about translators. One of his translators was Tobita Shigeo, and Tobita Sensei started a correspondence with Miller. It didn't last very long, but their letters are incredibly rich. Tobita's letters are at UCLA. Miller's letters are unfortunately lost. They might be in someone's closet, but Tobita Sensei was a translator. He knew the value of archival materials. He knew the value of letters. So I highly doubt he would have destroyed these letters. And so I have been on a search for 4 years looking for these letters from Miller. But fortunately for us, Miller carbon copied some of these letters. And in the letters, they show that concerning translation, and this might be true for Miller, many authors, concerning translation, Miller was clearly not aware of his Japanese audience, or not very well aware, because some of the things that he comments to Tobita Sensei about, like, why are you footnoting this? Why are you trying to explain this? You don't need to explain this to your readers. It's clear. But in actuality, in translation, cultural differences, certainly, it's not clear. And so these letters are a really good view into Miller's obliviousness to the diverse aspects of Western and Eastern culture, American and Japanese culture. It's quite rich and full, as I say. Unfortunately, the correspondence ended badly, and they were not able to, they only talked for a few years. Moving quickly here, coming back full circle to this Madame Butterfly. When Miller married Hoki, he got a lot of national attention in Japan. And Hoki brought along a whole entourage of live-in friends, which brought Miller quite a bit of, as we'll talk about on the next slide, a lot of gossip. This picture here is for one of Miller's German publications. This is actually not Hoki. This is Puko, who lived in the Miller residence for some time. Created quite a bit of drama. Miller had all these young, beautiful Japanese women living there. And of course, him being known as, a fairly sensual guy, there was just a lot of rumors going on. But in his book, My Life and Times, published by Playboy in 1971, he intentionally portrays his life as being surrounded by everything Japanese. So one of the things that I'm working on right now, my next project, article and presentation for the Popular Culture Association, conference is Miller and the Gossip magazines. And this has been really exciting and interesting to track down. And I use, believe it or not, Yahoo Auction is my #1 go-to source for finding gossip magazines that talk about Henry Miller. And I have found literally dozens of them. And these gossip magazines have been a really rich source of selective information, let's just say, because of course they're gossip magazines, they extrapolate on things. But what I've been able to do for some of these articles is to actually connect archive letters from some of the people who wrote the articles or who interviewed Miller, and connect that with the actual articles, and to kind of get this nice comparison of what was maybe not necessarily real, or but who these people were that were writing these gossip magazines about Miller. Along with Miller's 1960s and 1970s, starting with the Tanazaki's texts, he began writing more about Japan. His most lengthy and I would argue most important work is about the death of Mishima Yukio. I have an article that's coming out hopefully here in the next few months about this reflections of the death of Mishima. Strangely enough, you can see here, this is the inside of the American version of the text. He's talking about the seppuku suicide of Mishima, and he's got a picture of him and Hoki on the flat cover there. An interesting publishing choice there. He wrote a lot about Japanese women, and he was also requested to write opinion pieces. And a few of these I've been able to track down. They've never been published in English. So the Japanese audience, Miller specifically was writing things for his Japanese audience, knowing one, that he would get paid well, but two, that he had such a large audience there that he could justify taking the time to write those. Just for example, this death of Mishima, Miller was paid $10,000 US, sight unseen, for the article. You know, he was really quite surprised about that. Okay, I'm running out of time here, but just a couple of things real quick. Japan really started showing some interest in Miller in 1940. They promoted his research, his writing in watercolors. An excellent source for me has been the advice and the support of Honda Yasunori, who has written more than 50 articles and I think it's 4 books about Miller using archive research. So there's a lot of material here in Japan in Japanese about Miller. There have been 2 academic journals, and Delta, the newest one, is about to publish its 12th volume. And Hoki even is still alive and well. And she appears occasionally in weekly magazines talking about Henry. So in conclusion here, you know, this idea of Madame Butterfly kind of created for Miller this unique image of, maybe not unique, but even actually far opposite of unique, a stereotypical Western white male image of Japan that was highly influenced by Japanism and Japanese art, the actual paintings, the literature, and in particular movies, which I didn't really have time to talk about, outside of Tanazaki's Kagi. Kubo was promoted Miller's watercolors, and his marriage to Hoki still has lasting impact here in Japan. Just in February, Hoki was featured in another weekly magazine talking about Henry Miller and D.H. Lawrence. So she's still in the news. I'm friends with Hoki, I've met her several times, and she has shared several interesting stories, which may or may never be factually validated. Okay, I think I'm going to end there. I will say that in 2019, the final volume of Miller's complete Japanese works in Japanese, the second series was finished. So there's a 16-volume set of Miller's literature and essays that has been published here in Japan. The second series, meaning that the first series was from 1960s. Okay, I'm finished. I kind of rushed through some of that last little bit there, but hopefully there's some things that piqued your interest, and I really appreciate your attention and hope that you know, we can have some discussion here. So thank you. Let's see, who's Josh, are you there?
Hey, Wayne, we're here. We're just questions are all open. So if anybody has any questions or comments to Wayne, please direct them to him directly.
Hi, Wayne.
Hello.
Long time no see. I wonder if you remember me, though.
Yeah, I sure do. It has been a long time. I'd say about 7 years, I guess, since
I think so, yes. Since right.
Yeah.
Well, since nobody else is asking you anything for now, I was just wondering. I have a very small question, but you did mention towards the end of your talk that you didn't have time to talk enough about the movies, except for, you know, the Tanizaki one. And you also mentioned at some point that when Miller was in Paris, he, I think that was the late 30s, right? If I understood correctly, that he watched, or like a lot of Japanese movies were showing in the theaters, and that he watched some of them. I was curious what kind of movies those were, like what kind of image of Japan visually, right? So he never made it to Japan. He read various things about Japan, but before he actually saw Tanizaki's Kagi, which was in the 60s, he saw a bunch of other Japanese movies in the 30s. And I was curious what kind of movies those were and what kind of image of Japan he was exposed to. If you know anything that you can tell us about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have made every effort to kind of record the films that Miller mentions, the Japanese films. In particular, I went to UCLA to try and find a couple letters. There's a cat.
Yes, I have two of them.
I have, there are a couple letters that Miller wrote to Anis Nin where he mentions, please go see these Japanese films and whatnot. But that section of the letter, I haven't been able to find the names of those films. But I do know that even in, well, certainly in Paris, he was watching a lot of Japanese films. I would say that they are, at that time, I think France was getting quite a bit of actual Japanese films. So they were, they weren't westernized Madame Butterfly type of things. So he was actually seeing these types of films. So as a critic by 1960, I think he had, I would say that he easily had 30 years of experience of watching Japanese films. He was particularly he particularly liked the samurai and the geisha films. In particular, the samurai, for sure.
I mean, it might be interesting to connect to someone who's like a Japanese cinema specialist and see what kind of movies were being made in Japan and circulated in Europe, in France, around the time that Miller was there, and to see what it's fascinating to know that at the same, so he was watching the Cary Grant Madame Butterfly, and at the same time, with the same eyes in the same environment, he would also watch an actual Japanese
films, right? And that, I think, you know, even watching the Japanese films, I still think that he had this very romanticized view, unrealistic. There's a great quote, right, or there's a great sentence by Ueno, who says, you know, you have the most idealized picture of Japan, a picture of Japan that never has existed.
Okay.
And so he really liked these, especially by the time when he was living in Big Sur, he would travel up to San Francisco and watch the films in San Francisco, the Japanese films. And then by the time he moved to Pacific Palisades, there were 3 Japanese movie theaters in around Little Tokyo of Los Angeles. And he would go there quite often to watch the, by that time in the 1960s and 70s, there were highly dramatized you know, depictions of Japan. Yeah, but no, I agree with you. I've actually tried to track down a few people and email them about you know, what types of films or
right.
The theater that Miller went to in Paris, he wrote the name of the movie theater, and I actually did email them,
right,
but they have no records from the 1930s.
It is a long time ago.
It is, yeah.
But I mean, I am not very familiar with like the cinema as an industry, and when it took off in Japan, I don't think there would have been like in the hundreds in the 1930s, right? It would probably be just, I don't know, few tens of, especially the ones that traveled all the way to Europe and were shown in European theaters, right? So it would be interesting to, well, track them down at some point.
Track them down, right? Yeah, I think you're right. Definitely, probably only, you know, maybe a couple dozen, right?
Right. Yeah. And then one other, right. And one other comment, and this is just a comment, you mentioned about the translation, one of the first Japanese translations of Sexus, I think it was, where they kept the well, tricky bits, the juicy bits, let's say, in English, right? That really reminded me of Chamberlain's work on translating the Kojiki, where he, instead of rendering the juicy bits in English, he translated them in Latin. And that's all, just
right.
weird thing that popped into my mind while I was listening to you. Thank you for the great talk. I learned a lot of new things about Miller. I never knew that he was also a watercolorist.
Okay, great. Yeah, I wish my screen's too big to move around, but I could. I've got several of his watercolors around the room. Not originals. Well, one original, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
that was really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining from Osaka, right?
I'm in Tokyo now, actually.
Oh, that's right. You moved what, a year or 2 ago, right?
Yes, Josh is my colleague.
Oh, okay. Oh, how about that? Okay, there you go. All right, nice, great.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. All right. So David, let's see. You're asking, did really because you didn't want to spoil the illusion. Okay, so David's question is, did Miller really not want to come to Japan because he didn't want to spoil the illusion? Or are there other examples of this in Miller's fantasy and life? I do think that he was afraid to face the reality of a real Japan without, you know, and come here and see the daily life, right? The realities of the ins and outs. And I do think that he was probably consciously aware that his image of Japan was maybe not so realistic. I don't have any proof of that yet, but at the same time, the other example that I might give would be Israel. One of Miller's best friends was Bezalel Schatz, who lived in Big Sur for about 4 or 5 years, then went back to Israel. And Miller was constantly saying for 30 years, or 25 years, that he would like to visit Schatz in Israel. This gets into a lot of a whole different realm of Miller's life, but he never went there either. Constantly saying, I want to go there, I want to go there, your people are my people, type of thing. And then not ever actually going there. Now, what may just be the reality of everything is that the physical challenges for him to go to Israel and Japan in his 70s were really just too great. He had hip operations. His walking became a bit of an issue. He became very not paranoid, but wanting to avoid the paparazzi. He knew that if he went to Japan, he would be getting probably more attention than he sometimes got in Europe. In fact, Paris and well, France and Japan, you could argue, I could argue that actually he was probably possibly more famous in Japan at the time, depending on the particular period. So yeah, did he not want to just spoil the illusion? Yeah, that's part of it. Did he not want to actually go and go through the hassle of traveling to a completely new culture in his 70s? That can be another very key element of why he did not come. I did mention in 1967 when Hoki came back to Japan and Miller did not get off the plane, and that his astrologist said, if you get on that plane, the plane will crash. And one of Miller's friends that I'm friends with now, he's 95 years old. He says, isn't that quite interesting? Because if Miller had gotten on that plane and it would crashed, he would be the angel of, a harbinger of death, an angel of death, which would have kind of gone completely against Miller's life philosophy. So kind of interesting side note there. Any other questions? You can chat them or just speak up.
Well, I might ask a couple of questions, if that's okay, Wayne.
Sure, go right ahead.
So I have two, one on a smaller level and one on a larger one. So I think the first one is, I'm curious if you have any further details about, how Miller was marketed, especially in those early days, right? You mentioned that he was translated as part of like some sort of gentleman's club, I think. But to reach a wider audience, do you have any kind of further details about how that process came about? One of the things that I thought of immediately, since you mentioned it happened in like the 50s or so, was that it would be roughly around the same time as like the Taiyozoku kind of genre was coming out in literature and film, right? So I wonder if, it's coming out, or Miller's work is being released to a wider public, and it's kind of melding with this the popularity of these other genres, or kind of linked to that other genres at the same time. And on a broader level, I imagine, although I could be wrong, of course, in the English language scholarship on Miller, the focus might be, of course, his relationship with the European countries, with France or Greece, and especially since he actually stayed there. I'm wondering if, since you are focusing on something that has been left out in English language scholarship on Miller, if you see a marked difference in the way he relates to Japan compared to how he relates to, let's say, France or Greece or anything like that.
Okay, all right, great. Those are two really good questions. I'm gonna, for the first one, as far as marketing and the publishing, I'm going to actually go back to a conference that I attended in what's north of Tokyo there. Anyway, it was a few years ago. I went to this conference, and in the same panel as me, there was a Japanese woman that was talking about the Japanese government and its efforts to publish American literature in particular, starting in 1953, which 1953, 1952, it's the end of the occupation, right? And so this woman had a conspiracy theory argument for her presentation at this conference. And the conspiracy theory was basically that the Japanese government was trying to promote American literature that would endear the Japanese people to America. So try to kind of help, through this avenue of literature to help give the Japanese a positive image of Americans. And I presented there before her talk, and I was talking about Miller and something. And she did a quick search, and the publisher or the agency that helped first get Miller published in Japan was actually involved with this organization that she had this conspiracy theory about. And she was like, well, maybe if my conspiracy theory is true, then Miller was used by the this special group to promote America as a friendly, maybe not a friendly place, but to give exposure to give the Japanese exposure to Americans. So that's of course a conspiracy theory, but Miller does seem to fall into that, possibly chosen to be promoted that way. During that interval from the 1940s, he was making contact with people, and so he was able to get that watercolor exhibit shown in 1953. That's also the year that his the first novels came out that were in 1954 and whatnot. And so because he went first through that Tokyo Special Editions Club, which is sort of focusing on pornographic literature, he was definitely touted and promoted in Japan as a risque American author, banned in his own country type of thing. And so that also helped fuel the promotion of Miller's work in Miller's literature in Japan. So that risque element. Does that answer your first question?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And maybe if we have time later, we could also discuss that further, because I think there's another kind of a parallel research going on with Korea, and again, a whole different set of circumstances, but trying to promote Americans' image through literature and film is a topic. Right. Yeah, was a topic that was being researched in the Korean field as well. Okay, yeah, great.
Yeah. So that I think Miller falls into that for sure. And then the second one you asked.
Yes. So, like, how do you see kind of his treatment or relationship with Japan compared to what?
You are right. Well, certainly. That's an interesting way to pose the question, you know, to look at it. How did he, I think he has, he treated Japan as more of like this place where he wanted to be perceived well, or have a good image. And Europe and England, but in particular Europe, he had experiences there that not always positive. So I think one of the things is that while as much as he loved Europe and he went back several times, I think he had this sort of a much more realistic idea that, okay, Europe is nice, but it has some problems. And even by the end of his last trips there, he was saying, I'm just getting tired of these old French buildings with, you know, that are cold and things like that. And so I think he's a bit more critical of Europe, whereas Japan, he kept that kind of romantic ideal, even though he was afraid of the cold. But you know, I think he treated Japan as sort of his, well, he definitely was making a lot of money from Japan. So he kind of, he definitely tried to portray Japan in a very positive light, I think.
Okay, interesting. All right, so I'm going to set aside now because I think there's a question from somebody.
Right. Yeah. So Alexandra.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I really learned a lot, and this is my first time joining this workshop, and I'm really glad I started with your presentation.
Okay.
I had a very, very simple question, and I'm sorry if I missed it. You were talking about Ueno sensei, and I was wondering what's his full name, because I was trying to search some information about him, and I haven't read your article yet. So if you could tell me his name and maybe the title of your article. I wanted to check The Lost Correspondence.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in Western, like Japanese philosophers and European American writers interactions. So I would.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, that would definitely be. Let me just pull this up here real quick. I can put a link. I have the file of the article. Did you say you were able to find the article, or?
Not yet. I will do that after the presentation.
Okay.
I was just focusing.
Yeah, I'll. So if you go to my academia page, I think it's like the 5th or 6th article down.
Okay.
And it's called Henry Miller and Ueno Shori, a Trans-Pacific Friendship. Ueno Shori is his pen name.
Okay.
So Ueno Kenichi is his real name, and yeah. So he wrote numerous books about Miller. And there's just a couple here, but I think I had this picture on there, but none of it's translated into Japanese. All right, excuse me, none of it's translated into English. This is called Tropics and Voyager. It's got Miller's picture on the front there. And you know, there are several articles in here about Miller in general. The letters certainly delve into the philosophical range. And I think in the beginning of this book, I have the English version, but Miller writes the introduction for Ueno's book. Oh yeah, here it is. So in the introduction, this is the one by Miller. Oh, that one's okay. Well, that one's, but anyway, Miller does write, maybe it's in this one, I forget. But anyway, Miller does talk about Ueno as a philosopher of the samurai type. So that would certainly be.
I'm very curious about what his samurai type was like.
Yeah, stoic, hardworking, you know.
Of course.
like a movie. You can imagine Miller kind of imagining samurai as movie or a woodblock cuts or something, you know, like. But yeah, kind of interesting. Okay, yeah, that I think would be good.
Thank you so much. In the meantime, I also found your academia page, so I'll follow you. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see here. Okay. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, David asks, is Hoki an extension and a excuse me, an extension of the fantasy illusion? Yeah, that's a great way to put it. When he married Hoki in 1967, on his wedding day, there were a bunch of Japanese news reporters, right, for the gossip magazines, the weeklies and the newspapers and things like that. And it's recorded in, documented in several of the articles that report on their wedding, that Miller was just so thrilled to have finally married Hoki, who he had had this infatuation with. And he was going around saying, I just married Japan. I just married Japan. And meaning that he completely, effaced Hoki as an individual and just, oh, she's representative of Japan. Not an individual, not a woman, not someone with their own type of, personality even. It's just like, oh, I just married Japan. And he loved her music. In particular, Hoki's she has an interesting life story in and of her own self. She went to Canada to get musically trained. Went to the same university that her mother went to, got trained in piano, graduated at the top of her class, and came back to Japan, and made a specific niche for herself in her music. She started playing the classic, not ragtime, but 1920s, 1930s music that was sort of getting lost at that time in the 1960s, 1950, early 1960s, late 1950s. So she started learning these old jazz tunes and all these songs from the 1920s and 1930s that were popular in Japan, but also popular, most of them were probably even Western songs that Miller really loved. Miller was a huge musicphile. He had music all the time. Everywhere he went, he had a record player. And when he met Hoki and the music that she was playing, he just was like that part that brought him back to the 1920s and 1930s. And she was able to play several of his favorite tunes. In fact, I was just translating an article here that gave the name of one of the songs that he always requested. So yeah, that her musical talent, and she was definitely an extension of that dream of Japan that he had. Okay, Scott, go ahead.
Thanks for the talk. So I have a question that is a bit on the methodological side. I see that you're using a lot of correspondences and letters, which I think is really fascinating. And I'm wondering if you have come across any difficulties with how you use these letters, or if there are any things that you see in these letters that you will not see with other sorts of material.
That's a good question. I would say that even in his letters in particular to the Japanese, Miller exhibits a sort of obliviousness to, obliviousness might be a bit harsh, but a bit of, yeah, obliviousness to the realities of Japan. And his correspondence, including Ueno and Tobita Sensei, and even probably Kubo to some extent, all try and say, Miller, you're slightly off there. And so there's not so much a, he's pretty, well, I guess I could say is he's pretty consistent in both his writing and his letters and the interviews that he did, which have also been published in Japanese, several of them. He's pretty consistent in his romanticized view of Japan. So except in the area of dealing with Japanese businessmen, he definitely had a bad impression from that 1953 artwork exhibit that must have burned him pretty good. He was pretty poor in 1953, and to lose dozens of watercolors and never get paid for them, and probably have shipped them all over by himself. Yeah, he probably was still pretty miffed about that. Pretty angry about that his entire rest of his life. But otherwise, I think I feel like I can say that there's not a whole lot of, if I look at the letters, there's not a whole lot of material that I'm struggling with. How do I work this into my argument? Does that answer your question, or you need a different angle?
Yeah, I think that I just thought it would be quite challenging, in fact, to sort of bring the conversation together, because you have all of these letters that are kind of traveling between people, and there's a conversation that's been going on. And that's really interesting, because normally when we think of a resource, we think of it as one author who's writing the thing, but in this case, it's sort of a conversation that's going on. And I thought that was just that might perhaps, for instance, help us see different ways in which these people might disagree on things, in which we have different people who are looking at these things, different perspectives. And like you're saying, maybe someone says that, well, Mr. Miller, you're just seeing this whole Japan thing incorrectly, right? And I guess it's kind of that way. That might be one way in which the letter as a material might be a different way of looking at a story. But this was very fascinating. I don't know anything about Miller, so this was the first time
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad you were able to join. Yeah, I would stand by my argument that across the board, Miller had this dreamlike image of Japan, and even if somebody told him, "Oh, you're dreaming of a Japan that's never existed," he just kept on with his dream. That's kind of the way type of guy Miller was, I would say. Opinionated, but still open, but also very dreamy, clownish, sometimes, even. And yeah, there might be some examples that if I looked at a few closely, but yeah, maybe I'm so absorbed in it that I'm missing some of the discontinuities in some of the correspondences. I don't know. I'll keep your thought in mind there.
Can I ask another one?
Sure.
If no one, I mean, I don't want to take too much time of the discussion time, but kind of linked to what Scott was saying about your methodology with using the letters and them being correspondence. They're also not usually the kind of material. Well, so I'm speaking from the point of view of a person who does literature and analyzes literary text, right? Probably you're not necessarily interested in Henry Miller's literature, or you are, but this is not what your presentation today was about. So I was wondering, I know that a lot of people who are in the spotlight, especially people who write a lot, they also kind of, even in their private correspondence, they do have an inkling that perhaps that's going to see the light of day in a form that's different from the form that they intended it. Yeah, it's not going to be exclusively private conversations. They keep a diary, but they kind of think that those diaries are going to be published one day after their life. Same goes for their letters. Do you see any kind of such awareness in Miller's correspondence? Does he write in a way that, you know, makes you think that he's expecting sometime in the future for his letters to be read by, well, not Ueno sensei or Tobita or whoever else he was communicating directly with?
Without a doubt. From his earliest days, we're talking 1920s, Miller was writing his letters to be read. I could pull off here a dozen books about of Miller's published correspondence. And there are even interestingly, the Ueno correspondence. I asked Ueno when I met him one of the times. I said, why haven't you published Miller's correspondence? Because there's so many letters by Miller that have been published, and he's like, oh, Henry asked me not to publish them, so I never did.
Okay.
Now, maybe Henry did ask him that, but Miller tended to say, don't publish it until I'm dead, type of thing. But yeah, they are very much, just look at here's one here. This is, Henry Miller and James Laughlin, selected letters. This is just one of many such books. So yeah, Miller was always, in fact, I had a Miller conference a couple of weeks ago, where one of the people was talking about how, in Miller's writing, it's actually kind of not difficult, but it's unique in the sense that he almost always was writing for prosperity, right?
So even in his personal correspondence.
Very much so.
And okay, so in that case, for example, when you're using his letters, when you're analyzing his letters, do you also analyze them as, I don't know, pieces of more than personal correspondence? Do you do some sort of text analysis that is closer to the kind of text analysis you would do on his novels? Because he is writing for an audience outside of his close friends, right? So in a sense, they are literary texts.
Right.
Maybe, right. I don't know.
I would say that I probably avoid that to an extent, although I would argue that Miller, at least as far as Japan is concerned, Miller intentionally seemed to have added not embellishments, but aspects of Japan in there.
Right.
And good example of this is, and to answer David's question, was there any Hoki correspondence? When Miller divorced Hoki in 1977, he gave, in the divorce contract, he signed off and said that Hoki could publish his letters to her after he was dead. And so that's what she did. Yeah. And those original letters are in Kubo's museum up in Tochigi prefecture, north of Tokyo. So the original Henry Miller letters to Hoki are there. And of course they've been edited, the published version was edited. Yeah, Miller knew when he was writing all these love letters to Hoki, when he was writing at the end of his life, he was writing all these love letters to Brenda Venus. He knew that all of them would be published. or anticipated that they would be.
Right. So
Yeah.
there's a certain level of, let's say, fictionalization that he applies to everything that he writes. And
Right.
well, we should expect a certain level of literariness in his letters that will not necessarily be available in us commoners exchanging emails. We don't necessarily expect them to be made public at any point.
Yeah.
Well, I don't, at least.
Right.
I hope they won't. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. To go back to David's question there about the Hoki correspondence, I mentioned in the talk that Miller was obsessed with Hoki, and I went to Tochigi to look at the Miller letters to Hoki, and I was looking through some of them, and clearly, well, obviously, and not surprisingly, the editor of the letters left out some particular letters. But as I was going through those letters, it happened to be maybe it was about 2017, and it was kind of the peak of the news cycle around Harvey Weinstein and the Me Too movement and things like that. And I was quite struck by some of Miller's letters, and I was like, I wonder how he would have held up in, like how this would be perceived, now, because quite frankly, some of them are just like, geez, you sound like a stalker. Henry Miller sounds like a stalker. Why aren't you calling me? Why aren't you coming to see me? Why do you not answer my letters? Why da 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 da? Like, geez, dude, because she's 50 years younger than you. Like, what are you thinking? But anyway, that was kind of an interesting thing that stuck in my mind at that particular time. Yeah. Any other questions?
I might ask a couple more if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So maybe to just kind of pick up on a little bit on the discussion about letters. So you've mentioned that this presentation is basically the outline of your book, your upcoming book, and it's what I found really interesting is that there's very many different aspects to it, right? Like not just Ueno, but also like Millett and all these different people involved in kind of fostering this relationship between Henry Miller and Japan. So maybe just out of curiosity, is this kind of how you see yourself organizing the book in general, kind of like Henry Miller and relationship with Japan seen from all of these different actors involved?
Yeah, that is how I see it, and if you see some problems in that or some complications that, please let me know. Sure. But what I would, for instance, like let's take the Kate Millett chapter with her experience in Japan. How I envision tying that into the whole narrative of the text is that the previous success of Miller's work in the 1950s in Japan allowed Millett, when she came to Japan, to get easy access to Miller's work, which then obviously had a direct impact on Miller in 1970 when Sexual Politics was published, right? And so like this not reoccurring, but like this continuing unexpected impact or effect of certain events happening, then coming back later to have a significant meaning in Miller's life.
I don't know. I think it's really interesting. I didn't mean to suggest it was a problem. I think it's quite interesting, okay. Right? Kind of giving us more to think about in terms of, again, what constitutes an author and the materialities of publishing and building that author persona. And maybe if I could just follow up with a smaller kind of question. So you mentioned, I think earlier in the presentation, there's a lack of material for his correspondence around 1940s to 1953. So I'm wondering if, obviously this is hard to say without the actual material existing, but do you have any kind of hypotheses as to why this might be? Is this something, tied into the fact that Japan and America were at war during some of those years, and the sentiment about Japan might have been different?
Yeah, definitely during the war years, there probably would not have been any correspondence or any real reason, I guess, for him to be corresponding there with the Japanese or with any Japanese. There could be, but certainly after the war ended is when Miller's books started trickling into Japan, and translators were wanting to get a hold of them. And so there's that little bit of correspondence there. He wasn't published in Japan in the 1940s, wasn't available in any venue until really 1952, 1953 with the Tokyo Club. So I think that would be a limiting factor as to why there's not more correspondence from that period. Plus, by at that time, 1940s, he was living in a hut. Some of his letters might have gotten damaged and things like that. Or he does tell of a time where he took all of his correspondence and manuscripts he didn't like and took them out onto the cliff and burned them all. So maybe some things are lost there. But yeah, I think just being relatively obscure and unknown in Japan and Asia at that time is what keeps that interval from being more rich in content.
Okay. Yep, makes sense. Thanks.
If I may, just something that came to mind a second earlier, it's that I guess I'm somewhat curious about the post-war context with regards to how Japan sees itself, or how Japanese citizens might see themselves in the post-war, because I know, for instance, in Nagasaki, the case with the Glover House, which is where Madame Butterfly's story is supposed to have taken place, and a lot of this fictionized, but it's really in the post-war period the story gets really taken up and becomes a tourist attraction. And I'm wondering if this has some relationship to what you see with Miller, with this reappreciation of this exoticization in post-war Japan. And I'm really not so familiar with the literature on this, so this is all speculation, but I guess I'm just something that just came to mind a bit earlier.
Yeah, that's a great aspect there. I'll flip that a little bit and give you some examples of what Japanese thought about Miller in the post-war environment, because I have found some letters from Japanese people, and I've actually corresponded with a few people that were reading Miller in the early 60s, which is obviously slightly post-war. But some of the people that were talking about Miller and why they were attracted to Miller as a true literary figure was that they felt that these Japanese men in particular felt after the war that Japan had become very they had very much this feeling of being an island and sort of being trapped. And the Americanization of Japan, especially in the post-war environment, they were seeing a lot of their culture sort of disappear or be changed. And so they saw in Miller a voice that they could, latch onto, that somebody that was disliking their own country, America, and and writing about it. And then, these Japanese people, young men, were seeing in Miller like this, a voice of hope, sort of how one person described it to me as. So Miller, I think, by some was perceived as sort of an American voice of reason in the post-war environment, where you can read a lot about the Americanization of Japan in the post post-war environment. So Nagasaki, in particular, in Miller's work, gets mentioned quite often in relation to the Loti story, the Madame Butterfly aspect and whatnot. So Miller mentions Nagasaki and Hiroshima in his letters. By fairly often, I mean it's present. It's not like a one-time thing. You can definitely find that there. So I don't know if I answered your question, or kind of, I feel like I went off a little bit off tandem there.
It wasn't really a question, but yeah, no, that's interesting.
Yeah, Miller felt a lot of. Oh, go ahead.
Go on. No.
I was going to say Miller felt a lot of guilt over what the atomic bombs, and he believed that should not have happened. In a few of his letters to Japanese people, especially in the 1950s, he apologizes for what happened to Japan, and he makes indirect references to the bombs in some of his literature as well. Clearly showing a strong affinity for Japan and not as strong affinity for the United States.
Oh, that's really fascinating. That really makes me curious about how he perceived himself as a person in terms of, I guess, identity, national-wise or whatnot. If he felt that much guilt for something his country did.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. If you wanted to read a short, quick book about it, not about, but one that I really like. I don't know if I have, but John Burnside published a book a couple years ago, or on Henry Miller, or How to Be an Anarchist. John Burnside. He's he's a poet, but that's a pretty good book. I particularly like that one. Very small book, but I feel like Burnside had a pretty good grasp on Miller when he was writing that. So that might be, if your library has it or something. Now that's a complex question there, David. Do I think the interest in Miller in the early 1950s was partly due to the enforced Puritanism of the McCarthy years? I don't have an answer for that. But again, something that I mentioned before, that 1953 seems like a pretty, going back to that conspiracy theory that woman had about the publishers. It seems like a conspicuous year that the occupation ends, and then all of a sudden Henry Miller appears. So you might be able to make that argument. I probably would never be able to dig into that enough, because I think that would need certainly some serious Japanese historical knowledge that I do not have about the 1950s, and about the occupation. But could be a link connected with that conspiracy theory. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions. I appreciate you all tuning in for sure, and your good questions that we had.